Hang on. Good afternoon, everyone. We'll get started here. This is the last in the invited series that are under the rubric of Unsettling Records, Reworking Anthropology's Role in Turbulent Times. If I haven't introduced myself to some of you before, my name is Lisa Mitchell. I'm one of the co-organizers of this conference. And we would, first of all, my co-chair and I are going to chair and then provide the... Do you want me to tell you what I do to my students when that happens? My co-chair, Andrea Walsh, and I are going to chair and then provide the discussion for this session. First of all, we would like to acknowledge with humility and with respect that we are on the territories of the Coast Salish and Strait Salish people, and it is with much gratitude that we are able to live and learn on these territories here. So this session is entitled Engaging Records, and it is has a slightly different format than the other sessions that we've had so far. It's run as a series of Pecha Kuchas. Now I will just say that everybody has a different interpretation about how to say that word, so I don't offer that as the definitive one. If you don't know what a Pecha Kucha is, each presenter has 20 slides. Each slide is displayed for 20 seconds. We chose this format in part because we heard it was very well received at last year's Casca conference. So what works in the past, we're happy to try again. We also thought on a Friday afternoon towards the end of the conference, the idea of breaking with a sort of standard conference delivery might be welcome, right? Shorter format, shorter attention spans, maybe. We also hope that the Pecha Kucha might serve as a sort of useful format for stimulating our own and your thinking about productive forms of anthropological engagement with community through emerging and collaborative practices of record making. So I want to make clear, we're not trying to showcase or valorize Pecha Kucha specifically, and we invite your comments and your thoughts, including the presenters here, about the value of Pecha Kucha and its limitations as a means of bringing forth what gets created and learned through our research and practice. Okay, so without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker. We're going to change the order a little bit here to try and avoid technological problems. So our first speaker is, as you see in your program, and it's my very great pleasure to introduce Sara Perry, who we know from her time at UVic. Sara Perry, who is now at the University of York and in the UK. And her presentation is entitled Visual Records and the Production of Heritage.
Thanks so much for welcoming me here today. As you heard, my name is Sara Perry. I'm based at the University of York in the UK. I am the Director of Studies of both the Digital Heritage and the Archaeological Information Systems programs there. So since 2009, I've been working at the Neolithic site of Çatalhöyük in central Turkey as part of the site's visualization team. And that work is going to form the basis of my presentation to you today. Çatalhöyük is a 7,000-year-old site with evidence of 2,000 years of continuous occupation. And it's very well known in the archaeological community for being the convergence point in the articulation of post-processualism, what is effectively the discipline of archaeology's critical turn. Post-processualism revolves around a series of epistemological ideals that will be very familiar to you because they privilege reflexivity and multivocality, as well as the decentering of authority and community capacity building and empowerment. Since a post-processualist approach was first implemented at Çatalhöyük in the 1990s, various critiques have been launched at its efficacy in practice as it relates to excavation and field recording. Key for me, however, is the fact that its implementation in the context of visualization and public presentation has gone less examined. For nearly 20 years, various teams have grappled with reflexive, multivocal, community-driven approaches in their exhibitionary practice. But what's become obvious, paralleling the experiences of the excavation and recording teams, is that they haven't always been very sustainable. So I'd like to talk to you about how we have been attempting to rectify some of these unsustainable practices by investing in a form of collaborative curation in Çatalhöyük's Visitor Center. And that collaborative curation actively encourages contributors to be creators, to make mistakes, and then to rethink and redo their work in a very handcrafted way. So what we do is quite modest in nature, but I like to think that at its core it has the potential to be transformative for a range of individuals. So for those of you who don't know Çatalhöyük, it has a real wow factor, both in terms of its archaeology, but also in terms of its scholarly clout and celebrity appeal. Here's Prince Charles. But I have to say that what's always struck me most about Çatalhöyük is its deep involvement in training and reproducing archaeologists and related specialists. So each year, an average of 200 people work on site from around 24 countries. But these individuals are under a lot of pressure, which comes in part from Çatalhöyük's celebrity status, because there's a major demand for results and output, a demand that comes from many places, including the Turkish government, corporate sponsors, locals, and the academic community itself. In that scramble for results, you constantly feel as though you have to work faster and keep innovating in order to prove yourself and to meet expectations. The problem is that this pressure arguably compromises the very post-processual ideals that were originally meant to set the site apart, because it's hard to be reflexive when you have no time to think, or to truly embrace multivocality when you have no opportunity to build long-lasting human connections. So as a consequence, what you see are a series of trends I think, that are emerging at Çatalhöyük, which tend to involve abandonment of projects or just relentless output of materials in order to meet demand. So I joined the Çatalhöyük Research Project in 2009 as part of a new initiative, the visualization team, which now includes around 10 to 11 people, a mix of lecturers, grad students, and undergraduates from both Turkey and Britain. And we've contributed to many aspects of practice at Çatalhöyük, and there's some of them there. But I think it's fair to say that our primary responsibility is for redesigning Çatalhöyük's Visitor Center. The Visitor Center has a long and complicated history, which I will summarize by saying that there have always been many grand plans for it, none of which have ever materialized. It is a very humble space. It's a square box, basically, 10 meters by 10 meters by 4 meters tall. It has these whitewashed walls that are now completely crumbling all around the corners. There are a few recessed display cases. There is only one single display stand and one single electrical outlet that is in the middle of the room on the ceiling. The center is rarely subject to housekeeping, yet it sees over 15,000 visitors per year, 75% of whom are Turkish. What's important about the Visitor Center, I think, for you to know now, is that we cannot actually display any real artifacts from the site here because of government policy, even though the Visitor Center is literally right adjacent to where all of the material is coming out of the ground. And more importantly, we have no budget for the visitor center. So, to some extent then, born out of necessity, our team purposefully adopted an approach to the center's redesign that was grounded in affordable, low or no cost, evidence-based, easily modifiable design strategies using the full range of archaeological, media, and community records, meaning documentary records available to us. And I think that it has evolved into a meaningful pedagogical and intellectual exercise that nicely aligns with post-processualism now. So our method privileges small-scale, locally sourced, changeable displays. As a process, it involves us arriving on site each year and assessing the effectiveness of our previous year's additions to the center. So we do this via semi-structured interviews and informal conversations with site staff, site guards, locals, academic specialists, and Turkish and international visitors. Most of the work is done by students because our team is foremost a training ground for students. The students then conduct their own critical evaluations of the existing displays in the center, and data from both these evaluations and their interviews is then drawn together into recommendations for new modifications to the visitor center. The students review previous reports from our team's database, and then they propose very specific sections of the visitor center to redesign on a negligible budget in a 1.5 week time frame with materials that are sourceable from the local community. And we purposefully design the displays to be temporary and modifiable, knowing that when we come back next year, changing interpretations as well as problems revealed by our own evaluations will mean that we need to update the content. What's blatant about our outputs in the center is that they are multi-authored. They are produced by many people. They include many voices. They're modest and very bespoke. We make hand-painted wall hangings. We buy and use local products, often made by relatives of the site staff themselves. We draw upon the outputs of the other specialist teams on site to populate the displays. We have community members propose ideas and then offer us critique on these ideas as they're being realized. We produce small interchangeable signs that essentially can be tossed away whenever we need to. So there's a real do-it-yourself ethic behind our work. And this handcrafted nature means that we have seen criticism. Not, interestingly, so much from the public or from site staff or site guards or from locals, but primarily from academics and government representatives. Because our narrative is not single-authored, our progress is very slow, and because we do make mistakes, as all of us are still learning, and we're working between multiple languages, and we're negotiating a lot of different perspectives in our interpretations. But ultimately, I think that our pedagogical model has been meaningful because it has enabled a range of individuals to participate in and to contribute their own content to the design of the center, and then to experience how critique and judicious reflection shape the process of redesign. So it's linked to a reflexive form of learning and creative development, wherein simultaneous with generating new content each season, we revisit and remodel old content in an iterative, self-conscious, evolving way. So in the end, our team is not going to produce some blockbuster exhibition in Châteauhaiux's Visitor Center, but we are, I think, producing students and visitors to the center who are mindful. And our practices aim to be as transparent as possible because we literally do all of our work in the Visitor Center itself for everyone to come around and see and criticize. Most importantly for me, though, our cohort of Turkish students is growing each year, such that I can envisage a point in the very near future where, because of the fluidity of the process, the British cohort could step out entirely and be seamlessly replaced by the Turkish team. And that, I think, makes this a truly sustainable, impactful methodology in the long term. It might be modest, but it is a model of close apprenticeship and do-it-yourself investment that anyone can follow. So thank you very much for listening to me. Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Sarah. Is this on? Oh. Okay. Thank you, Sarah. So here's where we're changing the order a little bit. To avoid the technological problems, Thom is going to go last. And our next presenter is Danya from the University of British Columbia. Her presentation is entitled Presence, Absence, a series of photography projects created by young people who use drugs on the streets of downtown Vancouver.
As you can see, is this on? Yeah. As you can see, I retitled my presentation. I apologize. So, in the public imagination, street youth, in the public imagination, street youth are frequently defined through their relationships with place, whether because they are viewed as victims in need of our protection or criminals bent on destruction. Young people who are homeless and visibly addicted to drugs are often understood to be out of place in the city. At the same time, these young people may be understood to be in place in neighborhoods like Vancouver's downtown east side, which has long been imagined as the proper destination of the urban poor and other social deviants in Vancouver, sometimes with sympathy, other times with disdain. Alternatively, these youth are understood to be highly transient and therefore simply placeless. During 2011 and 2012, I worked with 10 youth who were homeless and visibly addicted to drugs on the streets on creating a series of photo essays related to their sense of place in the city. This was part of a larger 5-year ethnographic study I have been conducting on this topic. I use the phrase visibly addicted in order to emphasize the highly public experience of addiction for these youth in the context of severe material deprivation in Vancouver's inner city. The downtown east side in particular is a zone of intense surveillance and monitoring, where people who use drugs on the streets are subject to the gaze of epidemiologists, public health experts, politicians, activists, journalists, and of course, anthropologists. In this context, a large number of records compete for authority. This project resulted in a visual record, or perhaps better put, records, which are at once research objects and art. They both unsettle and reinforce conventional discourses and representations that would position these youth as, for example, out of place in a nice urban space like a community garden, in place in a marginal space like the downtown east side, or as simply placeless. Youth and I worked for a year on these photo essays, developing a concept, shooting and reshooting images, and discussing images as well as the wider projects. Although this was a collaborative venture, all of these images were taken by youth and have not been edited subsequent to developing or uploading. The themes youth chose to develop were diverse. One young woman wanted to focus on all sorts of different kinds of contrasts that were visible in the urban landscape, such as the flashy billboards that provide a backdrop for youth panhandling on Granville Street. Another couple focused on the homemaking projects they were navigating in order to get their children returned to them by the Ministry of Children and Family Development. The photo essays youth produced could illustrate what was at stake in their lives during a particular moment in time. But they also illustrated youth's desires to articulate new stakes in the city of Vancouver. Their photo essays often reflected a desire to reimagine the possibilities of place in Vancouver and for alternative forms of belonging and becoming in the city beyond those typically ascribed to them. I haven't always been like this, Jordan emphasized, as he led me to a garden he wanted to photograph for his project. I've spent 1 year clean here too, and I loved it. This is the best place on earth, you know, like it says on all those license plates. He was referring to a slogan developed by the province of British Columbia. Snapping photos, he talked about how much he loved normal stuff, like flowers, gardening, and being in nature. The images he took that day in the garden were a stark contrast to those he had taken previously, which focused on the most degraded features of urban space. Jordan later articulated that his photo essay was about what is visible on the surface of an internationally celebrated city like Vancouver and what is hidden from public view and only visible to people like him. Through his photo essay, however, he positioned himself as a part of both of these landscapes. The process of producing these photo essays was performative. It created space for youth to re-engage with the city in relation to particular memories, life events, and imaginings. Terry's photo was about getting back to fond childhood memories before the drugs and crime had taken over his life. He was not allowed to step foot on the property of his childhood home. However, he was eager to photograph the house from a distance as a symbol of where he hoped to be living in a year's time. Through his photo essay, Terry seemed to be actively reimagining an idealized past in relation to a pained present. As Lee and I were working on his first batch of images, I was struck by the numerous photographs he had taken of Vancouver's most desirable downtown living spaces and parks, and of various construction sites. I immediately assumed he was developing a political commentary, on gentrification, for example, until he interrupted me to point out small details in the images and explained that he planned to get a job in construction doing a particular kind of welding once he had pulled his life together. As we looked at his images of different sports apparatus, I was reminded of his reaction to the 2010 Winter Olympics and raised the subject with him. While some youth expressed resistance to the games in ways that aligned with the protesters in downtown Vancouver demanding housing, not games, others looked forward to being a part of them. "I'm excited," Lee had said one week before the opening ceremonies. "I think I'm just going to have a good time and walk around downtown with people from all over the world, you know?" Lee consistently asserted that his project was not focused on his marginality, but on the comfortable future and progress he imagined for himself in the city, going to work, playing sports on the weekends and in the evenings, and enjoying the excitement of city life. This record, as I am presenting it today, is of course partial and incomplete. Youth did not title their images, but they did express a desire for their real names to appear beneath them. They did not want their pseudonyms used for the purposes of confidentiality to appear instead. The fact that no youth appear in the images is similarly a result of strict institutional ethical guidelines regarding the identification of minors in the context of research on illicit drug use and crime. All 10 youth chose to take a self-portrait as part of their photo essays, but these could not be reproduced here and will likely never appear in any of my published or presented work. At the conclusion of this project, however, youth were entertaining the idea of putting on a show somewhere in the city. Unlike the research context, in this context, youth would be able to put their real names under their work and include their self-portraits. I end with this image, since Terry's shadow is as close to a self-portrait as can be included in this anthropological record. Thank you all for listening, and thank you to the organizers.
There we go. Those kind
All
of
right,
things.
thank you, Danya. Our next presenter is Steve Gaetz from York University. His presentation is entitled "The Bottom 3 Feet of the City."
Thank you. I love this format. But 7 minutes? I don't think so. Okay, I'll try to go quickly. I will try. And both presentations have been amazing. It's great that there's a real intersection between what we're talking about here. I suppose I should start talking about the presentation. So anyway, I used to work in the youth homelessness sector, and I've been doing research on homelessness for a long time. And so, there's a long interest in youth homelessness, understanding that experience. We know a lot about pathways into homelessness. There's structural factors, whether it's poverty or lack of affordable housing or supports for people, discrimination, homophobia, these kind of things. We know about systems failures like child protection that push people into homelessness. And we also know about the relational factors that happen in households that produce homelessness. But I'm kind of interested in moving away from that sort of biographical orientation to homelessness to looking at homelessness as a problem that we create. It's not so much about the individual, it's about how we create a problem, how we organize homelessness, how we respond to homelessness. And the bottom 3 feet of the city, as we'll see, I'm interested in the spatial aspect that comes when homelessness is made visible. So let's see, okay. So how do you know if somebody's homeless? How do you know if a youth is homeless, right? I liked your point, that there are different images we have or ideas. We might personally know someone who's homeless. We might have been homeless. But mostly we get our ideas about homelessness from secondary sources, the news media, friends tell us things, and we form ideas about them. And these ideas are important because how we think about youth homelessness impacts on what we do about it. If we think young people are victims, then that produces a certain kind of response. If we think of them as self-actualized, that produces a certain kind of response. But one of the things that's really clear to me about youth homelessness is that we often frame them as delinquent, bad, damaged human beings, dangerous. And these ideas go back over 100 years to notions of street urchins, but also intersect with how we think about young people in general, that they're irresponsible, irrational, make bad decisions, these kinds of things. And so that's important because, again, how we think about homelessness directs how we respond to it. So to get to that question, how do you know someone's homeless? I argue that there's a spatial dimension when homelessness is made visible, right? When you're walking down the street in Victoria, you could be passing by homeless youth all the time, but it's when you see somebody in a particular context that we suddenly reveal, aha, that is the homeless person, right? And it's what they're doing and where they are that frames for us and identifies that person in that particular way. And this gets us to thinking about space in the city, right? So there's a lot of work that's been done in anthropology and geography around geographies of space that are important to consider. This is a street scene in Toronto. You can see people walking around, they're doing different things, they're shopping, they're going places. There's meaning to that space. There's things that are allowable. Over here you have people who are selling things, selling ideas, selling products, that kind of thing. And we kind of understand that and accept that. But we have to understand that spaces are very important in terms of the production of meaning, and that we reenact through daily practice those meanings of space. But spaces are also spaces of exclusion, right? Not everybody has the same access to the city, right? There isn't the same permissions for people to do certain things. And so I'm going to talk about some of this. David Sibley talks about spaces of exclusion, but I'd say most of us go back to Lefebvre in terms of thinking about the city and how space gets produced and reproduced and used and by whom and for what purposes. And so one of the things Lefebvre talks about is representational spaces. So these would be parks or monuments or places that we understand a particular meaning. We create these for homeless people too. We create shelters, we create day programs, we organize homelessness by those spaces. And these are rather unusual spaces that we create. I always say that it's tough enough to live with other people when you choose them. Can you imagine being in a place where you're with 20 or 30 other people stacked up, 5 of them you're totally afraid of, 10 of them you don't know, but they're sick and so you don't want them coughing on you, and the rest you've never met before. We do this kind of thing, right? And we create these different spaces. And so these are important. But we also have to think about, in terms of geographies of space, representations of space. So how do we organize the relationship between spaces? And this is important in terms of how we organize homelessness too. Because not only do we have these targeted spots where we warehouse people who are homeless, but people who are homeless have to move between them, right? You have to leave the shelter at 9 o'clock in the morning. You might go to a park where your friends are and hope that you don't get bothered by the police. You might go over to this other drop-in or day program because they have food there or coffee. Then later in the day you go over to this other place because that's where they're going to help you with your ID. You wind up at another place at night for dinner, if that's possible, and then back to the shelter. So these spaces, we enforce movement on people who are homeless, right? So there are these spaces, but there's also the spaces in between, and these are important because those are the places people also inhabit. Partly because why would you necessarily want to be in these other places, right? They're not necessarily desirable, but also people want to do things that anybody else does. And so what does happen when we're talking about that? So those are 2 ways of thinking about space, but now I want to talk about the verticality of space. When you think of cities, there's a vertical element, there's height. When you look up in any city, the buildings go up and ads for condos are always showing how wonderful they look, as if you're flying around in a helicopter. But these spaces are all private. Lots of things happen in these places, commerce, sleeping, eating, this kind of thing. People who are homeless don't have access to these spaces, right? They also don't have access to the spaces that are horizontal, like stores, shopping malls, bars, restaurants, unless they have money, because you have to be able to consume. The space that I'm interested in then is the bottom 3 feet, because that's where I think we define homelessness. And talking about the bottom, that sounds really horrible, right? It's like lower, people who are down below. It's important to know, that we always use this kind of metaphor of high and low. We use it when we talk about art. We use it when we talk about hierarchy of needs. We use it when we talk about class. We talk about caste, many different things, right? And we also represent it in terms of other kind of artistic things. And I always love the Charlie Chaplin image of the tramp, essentially a homeless person. And if you look at him, he's a triangle. He's an embodiment of hierarchy. Oversized shoes, big baggy pants, a very tight jacket, and a bowler hat that's just teetering on the top of his head, right? So he's embodying that notion of he is of the earth, of the lower element of society, if one could call it that. So I want you to look at this picture here. Here's somebody who is lying on the street. There's nobody walking by him at that point. But he's occupying those bottom 3 feet. And when you walk around Victoria today or tonight, look around and see who's in that space. He's lying there. Is he dead? We don't know. But most passersby aren't going to make that assumption. They're framing that person as the homeless person. They're not going to touch him and say, are you okay? That kind of thing. And that's important, right? Because in thinking about how we respond to homelessness, it's us that we have to sort of understand what this means. There's a real visceral element that comes from seeing people in these bottom 3 feet spaces, right? And we're all different. I'm not going to make presumptions about how you feel about it, but it's important to think to yourself what that means to you when you see somebody in those situations, right? What things get set in motion when somebody's in the bottom 3 feet? For you, intellectually, viscerally, emotionally, sensorily, affectively, right? Like what happens when you see that person? Next time you see one, think about like what happens in your stomach, right? So when in that bottom 3 feet, what is exactly going on? Well, different things are. People might be sleeping, right? They might be eating. I made that sandwich. They may be using substances. They may be making money. Now, those are all things I do, admittedly, on a daily basis. And the difference is that I'm not doing them in the bottom 3 feet. I don't get judged by that. One of the clearest manifestations of exclusion is that people who are homeless are regularly called to account for what they do. I get asked this all the time. I'd give money to someone who's homeless, but what if they spend it on booze? It's like, if you give them the money, it's not your money, So, but we do have these different senses of judgment, right? I do all of these things. I don't do them on the street because I have access to private spaces, right? When you're excluded, you're limited. You have to do these things in public spaces. So when you're in the bottom 3 feet, Teresa, there's a dog there, just pointing out. When, you also encounter other people. And when I used to do street outreach, I mean, you might have found this in your work. When you do street outreach, it's interesting because you'll meet with people who are just sitting on the sidewalk or they're panhandling. You get down low and you sit down and you talk with them and you're having conversation. Most people pass by and don't say anything, but often people come by and will say things like, you disgust me. Why don't you get a job? Racist comments. Things that people would never say to me, but people feel free to, right? So it's interesting that exclusion allows this openness to hate people. But the main thing that happens with passersby is people don't even look at you, right? They won't even look you in the eye. They'll look straight forward. Or you'll see families with children will take a wide berth, right? It's this sense of obliterating the homeless person, right? I don't want to look at them because what if they ask me a question? What if they ask me for money? And this is important to understand, right? Because that response of the passersby leads to other things, right? It isn't just benign because the state gets involved. when homelessness is visible. When homelessness is made visible, we start to ask our counselors to do something. There's a homeless person in front of my store. I don't want to go downtown shopping because there's homeless people, right? And it often leads to moral panics, right? So these are real headlines from Toronto in the 90s when homelessness erupted as a major issue. So, you know, they're nothing but thugs, they're criminals. Mel Lastman was like, I'm afraid of them. So we have all these notions of fear, and these lead to political action. In Ontario, the Safe Streets Act was instituted outlawing panhandling and squeegeeing, and when it was instituted, then Attorney General Jim Flaherty, who's now our finance minister, said, when it's no longer safe for someone to walk down the street or drive their car, it's time for the state to act. And that sounds like a real common sense idea, but it's actually a false concept. If I'm afraid of somebody because of the color of their skin, because of the clothes they wear, because they're asking me for money, or because they're sitting on the ground, the state has no obligation to address my fears, but they do, right? So one of the consequences of making homelessness visible by marginalizing people is a huge amount of police attention. We've done a huge amount of research on this. I'm going to show you this table, right? Numbers here, right? This is the number of tickets issued by Toronto Police Services for people panhandling and squeegeeing between 2000 and 2010. And in 2000, they handed out 600 or 700. 2005, it went up to about 3,000. 2010, 15,000 tickets. And that's just for panhandling and squeegeeing. That's not for drinking in public and all the other reasons. We use tickets, we use stop and searches to harass homeless people. It's part of a revanchist strategy to rid the city of homelessness. So we create homelessness as a problem, we make it visible, then we want to obliterate it. And the consequences of this are huge. The value of those tickets is over $4 million. And that debt doesn't disappear. What happens when you're homeless? If you get housed, the city sells the debt to collection agencies. So you'll get housed, and then like 2 weeks later, someone knocks at the door and says, you owe us $4,800 for tickets, right? And so our mayor's always looking for gravy. There's some gravy right there. The other thing we do with the city is we organize space in interesting ways that you may or may not think about. Park benches now regularly have the armrest there, and that's not there for your comfort. That's to stop people from sleeping on the bench. We also do things like take the heating grates from buildings, right, for the cooling systems that used to be in the sidewalks in Toronto. The city has paid money to take them out of the sidewalks and either put them on the roof of buildings or in the middle of roads so that people don't sleep on them. So we have a lot of money to spend on these kinds of things. And so, this is my last slide. I just want to wrap up by saying we need to really think about this. This is a Banksy image, which I shamelessly stole, but I'm saying it's him, right? And that's not my eye, it's Daphne's eye. I made that up. But anyway, the point is when we think about this, it's quite important. It's how we organize our response to homelessness, how we organize the way people move through the city, and the spaces that they're allowed to use or not allowed to use that is the problem with homelessness, right? And we can do things differently. We know lots about how to do it differently. But as long as we keep people in a state of homelessness for weeks, months, years, sometimes decades, then the response that we're going to come up with is the state is going to intervene in terms of law and order, which is not helpful, it's not productive. So I'll just conclude on that to just say, the problem of homelessness isn't that person you see sitting there. The problem of homelessness is how we deal with that person there. So that's it. Oops. It's good I didn't say anything while I was walking up it. It's like, that was crap.
We hope hope it's going to work. Is this on? Is this working? No?
It might be muted. Yeah.
Thank you.
Do you want to put that on your pants maybe?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you very much, Steve. We need to talk afterwards. We haven't had a chance to talk this. Yeah.
That's great. Perfect.
So, I don't know why I'm looking for your name here, Brian. Our next presenter is my colleague and Andrea's colleague in the Department of Anthropology here at UVic, Thom. The title of his presentation is Unsettling the Cartographic Record, Anthropology in the Salish Sea.
I hope. In the spirit of unsettling the record, I worked with my research assistants, Tia Hiltz and Megan Spencer, to review nearly 800 published ethnographic works produced primarily by anthropologists working with Coast Salish peoples. Though not perfectly exhaustive, these sources have been compiled over 20 years, and I believe represents the bulk of our ethnographic record in this area, and we found an unsettling legacy of anthropological cartography. I start with a very recent moment where the legacy of ethnographic mapping has come to be used by the state against Aboriginal peoples. Canada presented this map in a human rights hearing in Washington, D.C. recently, where Coast Salish communities have charged Canada with human rights abuses. In the map, the state denied Coast Salish peoples had any property rights at all because of the extensive overlap. I contrast this with a map I made that posits an imaginary idealization of Coast Salish territorial relations, a map we have come to expect but almost never find. Why has this map come to be the expected norm? What is the legacy of our ethnographic cartographies? Our earliest ethnographic maps are explicitly linked to the colonial purpose. John Wesley Powell, founder of the Bureau of American Ethnology, noted that if we are to conduct our Indian affairs wisely and induct our barbaric tribes into the ways and institutions of civilization, that the red man may become completely under our government and share into the benefits, the first step is to acquire knowledge of the Indian, including mapping. Boaz was drawn into this in 1887 in this remarkable map, made after only several months of working in Coast Salish communities. It provides a uniquely detailed insight into territorial relations, including shared territory areas and, at least for the island, a detailed accounting of the indigenous name for almost every Coast Salish village. Many other maps followed. In fact, a quarter of the maps in the ethnographic publications following Boaz followed this pattern. Village sites and often reserve locations, and this is just going so fast I can't pull it off. Challenging format, the Pecha Kucha here. Let's restart a little bit. All right. We have maps that show village sites with territorial boundary being marked around watershed and islandscapes in close proximity to the village. These maps make sweeping generalizations about land tenure and often miss critical inter-village ties and economic relations. While there are still some critics, these maps have also become to be reified by Indigenous communities as being central authorities to support territorial claims. In the 1990s, contemporary Stalo leadership drew on Duff's 1952 maps in efforts at political aggregation. Contemporary political units never quite matched Duff's territorial boundaries, but they draw directly on those identities to galvanize political cohesion beyond the Indian Act band. There's a tradition of drawing territories without boundary lines. We find about 10% of our maps in this tradition. And Homar Barnett's map is one in particular that is distinctive. After several years of working through Kroeber's culture area trait surveys, Barnett was not convinced that boundary lines were useful to represent territorial relations. While being criticized by some for contributing to a narrow view of title, it stands as a possible model for future ethnographic mapping projects, which I will return to. Language maps are another major anthropological mapping tradition. We found about 12% of the maps in the anthropological record follow these. And though scholars like Wayne Suttles took pains to point out that language and political and social economic identity are not directly connected, they often get taken as a proxy. The National Atlas of Canada is a great example of this. This map is derived from much ethnographic and linguistic data. However, like other state maps, its polygons of community relations disconnect people from the territory and inscribe them onto reserves. This very interesting map, however, it's not only the state that's drawing on these ethnographic legacies. This map by the Union of BC Indian Chiefs was at the center of discussions between Indigenous and political leaders working to implement the new relationship, which would provide territorial shared decision-making powers to aggregated political bodies. Culture area maps are another tradition. They make about 7% of the sources we reviewed, and they're very frequently reproduced in works not specifically on the Salish. And certainly the Coast Salish as a body has really come to be an abstraction that Indigenous people themselves have taken on as an identity, and often a shorthand for a lot more complicated things happening. And again, I can't keep up. Anthropologists have also mapped out territories of treaty relationships and tidal extinguishment, particularly in Washington State. Here around Victoria, the map in the upper right, Wilson Duff recognized how difficult it is to create maps of Douglas treaties, as colonial administrators barely knew the social and political organization of the people they treated with, creating, in his words, ethnographic absurdities. Another main tradition of ethnographic mapping is a more representational one. These are predominantly maps of village locations, place names, resource sites, and details of village settlements. Around 50% of the maps come in this category. The place names maps are of particular note, with careful documentation going back to at least the 1850s, with George Gibbs's work on the Boundary Commission, and carried out by most serious ethnographers in the area. And these, in spite of numerous errors and omission, continue to be highly valued by community members who are actively working on language revitalization and cultural revitalization. And they've also been central in anchoring land claim disputes in the deep local sense of place. A few maps have really focused down on more of the visual scale of space, plans of reserves and village life. There's a map there by Eleanor Leacock, for instance, of childhood life on the Seaward Island community, which is very interesting at that large scale. Well, the topics of our ethnographies aren't only about these territorial relations. We cover all the full breadth of anthropological discourse. There are a few maps that deal with other kinds of social relations. These two are outstanding examples, which highlight the dimensions of kin relations, which pervade, I think, and are critical for understanding what's important about Coast Salish social and cultural identity. And those maps certainly challenge the traditional boundary lines of ethnographic mapping in more Indigenous terms. Getting good at this. I'm trying to cover like the hundreds of years here in just a short time. So any study of Coast Salish cartography would be remiss not to mention the Coast Salish Historical Atlas. This is a very interesting project undertaken by Stalo Nation to reframe historical narratives through the lens of Coast Salish experiences. The text is fundamentally bound to a new Indigenous nationalism around Stalo identity. However, the details of that project are fraught with power, including the complete rewriting of Musqueam territory with place names in the Stalo dialect, and it continues to be a very contentious text. Other contemporary Indigenous mapping efforts have been less colorfully published, but equally concentrated on engaging the power of ethnographic cartography. Commonly, these maps return to the tradition of marking territories. Others take a more place-specific view, highlighting place names, resource use sites, and mythically transformed landscapes to challenge the industrial, commercial, and residential developments that continue to alienate Coast Salish people from their lands. So where are we going from here? In the collaborations with Indigenous communities today, like the ones we're doing here at UVic, there are many objectives of language revitalization, engaging community consultation over land and resource development, land title claims, at the treaty table and in the courts, and in formulating self-government. And the Coast Salish communities I'm working with are increasingly looking to powerful digital technologies to add depth and complexity to the ethnographic mapping tradition, leaving the simple task of inscribing a single line to represent all of the relationships to space and territory, and diving into a much more textured and hyperlinked kind of cartography. And hope this is somewhere we can continue to explore. Whew, thank you.
Thank you very much. Oops. Thank you. So Andrea and I are offering some brief comments here. And I'll just say by way of introduction that they are very brief on the 4 presentations, and that it is not a reflection of the quality of the presentations or the richness of the material. It's a reflection of our utter exhaustion at this point, and the fact, and I will come completely clean here, we threw this together right before this session because just don't ever plan a conference and say you'll agree to do anything else in your life at the same time. So, and I want to reiterate that although I'm reading and presenting the comments here, that they're very much a collaborative exercise between Andrea and I. She told me what to say, and I'm reading it. She made me say that, too. As I was sitting here watching your presentations, and particularly yours, Brian, I was thinking it's kind of unfair that we made you conform to the Pecha Kucha, and then we completely said, we're not doing that. So I want to start by acknowledging and thanking you so much for your willingness to try this. Some of you have tried it before, some of you have not. I think it was a real valiant effort by all of you, and I'm very grateful to you for doing that. So I'm going to offer, as I said, some brief comments. First of all, about the presenters in this session, and then I'm going to open it up a little bit more broadly, and then I will turn it over to all of you to ask questions and for comments. So Andrea gave me this as the starting point. So here we go. These Pecha Kucha presentations highlight the work of anthropologists who have made it their agenda to use anthropology to challenge and change the public record and representations of lives lived in particular places and spaces. In all of these presentations, we can see the role of anthropology in turbulent times. Hold on, that's very good, yes. First of all, using Çatalhöyük Visitor Center as an example, Sara Perry takes as her starting point for collaboration and for commentary on it, unsustainable practices, mistakes, and things that do not work in museum exhibitions. And I love that. I'm always eager to hear about the crap that goes wrong in trying to do anthropological work or just trying to do any work at all. It's just a very good and productive place to start. Her experience at the Visitor Center with its wonderful emphasis on do-it-yourself, transparency, the handcrafted nature of the exhibits, it really underscores that sometimes the solution to a problem is not flashy or expensive, but that there should always be other kinds of priorities. Solutions to problems in these collaborative endeavors should always be about respecting local conditions, about building and sustaining relationships, about building skills and knowledge and transferring them, and particularly about cultivating, and I love your word here, mindfulness, cultivating mindfulness in those who engage with anthropological knowledge or with the results of our endeavors. Danya, the photos taken by the on-the-street youth that you work with in Vancouver are compelling, they're beautiful, and they're disturbing. Watching your presentation, Andrea and I became very attentive to the ways in which efforts to create novel forms of engagement and dissemination often remain harnessed to long-standing institutional agendas, discourses, and practices. And this is not a criticism of your work at all, it's just something that very much came to light for us. So anybody who has tried to get a collaborative participatory project through ethics, or, yeah, I thought that would ring true, or who has had to argue that community workshops, meeting with elders, and strengthened relationships with groups outside the academy, that these things are legitimate forms of anthropological work and dissemination alongside the articles and the book chapters. You'll know what we mean here. That the ethics board accepted that the youth in your project could be referenced as addicted, as homeless or on the street, but refused them their own names and their own presence in the publicly disseminated photographic record of your project is maddening but all too common, right? It simply confirms that some kinds of individuals alarm people. Some kinds of individuals alarm established structures of power and authority. They alarm merely by existing. Steve and Danya, both your presentations spoke to the theme of the plenary as well. Just to add that as a comment, the notion of inclusion and exclusion, who gets into the record and who does not. Your term visual obliteration is so powerful here. The bottom 3 feet that you document through your work, Steve, with homeless youth in Toronto, the bottom 3 feet, as you point out, in fact, is really not invisible to the rest of us on the street. We choose not to see the inhabitants of the sidewalks. We choose to exclude them, and we choose to blame them for being there and for messing up our visual landscape. As you phrased so well, the problem of homeless youth, and we would say also of other excluded and marginalized groups, the problem lies not in their individual biographies or even in their collective histories, but in how we choose to respond. And so this kind of record making and troubling past records, I think, really shifts the sense of responsibility, and your presentation did that very well. Brian, you bring our attention to the visual record of cartography through the maps created by government surveyors, by past and contemporary anthropologists, and by the anonymous technological creators of Google Mapping, although I acknowledge that you've taken it another step forward to kind of locate those anonymous kind of God's eye perspective of Google Mapping. The ideal Coast Salish territorial map that eludes Brian and his Coast Salish collaborators is a vivid reminder that attention to records necessitates acknowledging that which cannot be recorded, or at least not very easily. And as you say so eloquently, maps can perpetuate silence and absences, even if we keep making the maps over and over and over again, trying to get it right. All right, I will shift here to speaking very briefly just upon some of the larger things that have come to us as we have been going to the invited sessions. Annalise Riles began her keynote address yesterday describing her experiences of doing research at the Central Bank in Japan in the aftermath of the 2011 earthquake in Japan. An event and subsequent period that she noted was profoundly disruptive, that called her world, her relationship with her research partners, and her expertise into question. But it was an event that was ultimately followed by a period of what she called rebuilding. She ended her talk by elaborating on the centrality of creative collaboration to what came after that earthquake and to what has renewed and invigorated her research. At the close of this series of invited sessions, and as we near the end of the conference, we are mindful of her comment that the sort of creative collaborative practice, thinking and research Anneliese envisions as productive is, to use her words, never straightforward. The nature of anthropological work, our persistent critiques of established discourses, the nature of our relationships or alliances with our research partners, and the value we place on kindness in those relationships, thank you, Michael Ash, for adding that, means our work is deeply and profoundly emergent, emotional, and complicated. In the invited sessions, we encountered echoes of this complexity and creative collaboration in the works of numerous people, and we don't mean this to be an exhaustive list. An exhausted list, not an exhaustive one. So here we include Trudy Smith's photographic exploration of Waterton National Park, her collaboration with scientists. Monica Patterson's hybrid and experimental exhibit, inviting museum goers to speak back to the existing records of childhood under apartheid in South Africa. And this entire series attempted to engage, and the larger conference too, attempted to engage different kinds of collaboration around knowledge production through the work of, including the work of non-anthropologists. Here, among others, we have documentary filmmaker Brenda Longfellow, who took us visually and virtually into the deep water horizon and oil frontier offshore. And the words, winging it, despite Andrea's instructions otherwise, winging it, the words of Coast Salish artist Maynard Johnny Jr., which asked us to think deeply about a particular place and its historical record and meaning for him through mark-making in art. We're delighted that this attention on the record, a term which initially calls to mind documents, recordings, marks, material objects, traces of which have been a stability and even fixedness, we're delighted that this attention has brought forth such rich discussions about the unfixed, the emergent, the in-between, and the unrecorded of human life. The presenters in these sessions have also highlighted in such thought-provoking and exciting ways what anthropologists have done, are doing, are trying to do, and are trying to figure out how to do. We want to call attention to the fact that we are in this place on Vancouver Island trying to rethink the record in anthropology. This place on Vancouver Island is a place with a deep history of anthropological record making through the likes of Boaz, Hunt, and others. What we heard loudly and clearly in the papers by Audra Simpson and by Judith Berman and Aaron Glass was the call to not only rethink, but to recontextualize those past records. In Unsettling Records, presenters have given us much to think about regarding the past, the present, as well as, and here Ken Little, your phrase, the not yet aspects of both anthropological practice and of being human. So we will leave it there and open it up. And I'll just say we open it up here to questions to the presenters in this session, as well to any other aspects of the conference or the invited series that you'd like to ask about or offer your insights and thoughts on. Thank you so much. So, questions, comments?
Yeah, great question. Lots. The application went through not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 times, and I'm still arguing with them about it. I fear that the final word is that in the context of or at least in the university context, so in the context of me presenting this work and publishing this work, the final word is going to be no, in terms of the self-portraits being included, as well as other images that were taken where people are visible, where we could have gotten releases. However, it is clear that young people do own those images. So those are their work, and they own them, and they have copies of them, and they have, they have the digital copies or the original film. So they can do what they want with them. I wouldn't go as far as to say, well, isn't that great? Because I think it just throws into relief how problematic, I guess the institutional context can be for these young people.
I have a question for Steve. I loved your presentation and your visualization. I could see the way the angles were shown through the eyes of someone on the street. I thought that was beautiful. But my question is, as someone who's sort of solution-oriented person, and this is probably a bigger question than you can answer now, but I'm wondering in your research, what kind of solutions do you see for the sort of space and urbanization with homelessness? I mean, there's a response of acknowledging, or looking in the eye of a homeless person and saying hello, but I'm just wondering, as far as a society, how do we organize ourselves in sort of finding solutions to this sort of individualization and, kind of space of urban settings?
We actually know a lot about how to do things differently.
Yeah.
By looking elsewhere in the world, and even in Canada, some places are figuring it out differently. I think if you want to respond to homelessness, you can do 3 things. Right? You can prevent it from happening in the first place. Right? So that means focusing on issues like poverty, but also early intervention strategies that people are at risk or become homeless, to ensure that they don't lose their housing or not for life. You need emergency services, because bad things are always going to happen. Right? But emergency services should be focused on keeping people safe and well and moving them out of homelessness as fast as possible. And then the last thing you need to do is provide people with accommodation and the kind of supports that they need. And in Canada, we focus mostly on that middle part. That's where our investment is in emergency responses. Some cities more than others. And it's a bit absurd when you think about it. I'll give you an example. 10 years ago, there was a big fire outside of Kelowna, eventually reached the city. And I think over 20,000 people were evacuated. So we put them in hockey rinks, motels, moved them to other cities, right? Because they lost their houses. Now, can you imagine if 10 years later we went back to Kelowna? If we went back now and went to a hockey rink and there were still people living in there, we'd say that's a failed emergency response. That's exactly what we're doing with homelessness, right? There are people who have been in shelters for decades. Nobody should be in a shelter for more than 2 or 3 weeks, right? And so we can do it differently. But I think the problem, again, it comes back to this social exclusion. As long as we see that person as somehow different and annoying, and that we imagine that it's all about personal choice and that people are lazy, they don't want to work, then we don't have to care, right? Then it's like, and we also trick ourselves into thinking that that emergency response, while it may not be great, but that's all we can do. At times of austerity, we can't do things different. It's actually really expensive. It's really expensive when we invest in emergency services. The services themselves cost a lot. When you keep people in a state of homelessness, their health declines dramatically, the chance of addictions goes up, the chance of getting involved with the law goes up, right? And we know that for a fact. We spend a lot of money on homelessness by keeping people in the state of homelessness. So we can do it differently. There's lots of good examples. I'd say Alberta's in Canada where they're leading the way. You know, Edmonton's had a 30% reduction in homelessness since 2008. Lethbridge 65%. Calgary 12%. Toronto 0%. I get in trouble for knocking Toronto all the time. But anyway, you know, so we do know what to do, but it's political will. And politicians aren't going to move on an issue if the public thinks that there is no solution, or that it's okay, or that these are bad people, right? And that we can ignore them or sweep them away. So that's where we have to like shift it and start looking at people in the eye, right? That the public has to engage the issue a little bit more.
I have another one for Steve.
I was going to sit. I like to sit. Just saying.
You mentioned the squeegee pump moral panic in the late 90s, and then since then the rate of ticketing homeless people has gone up every year. So, like, did that moral panic ever die down, or does this become a new way of thinking about homeless people?
It's always there, right? That these are like dangerous, bad people, but there are events that happen that lead to like periodic upticks. And on that chart, which I didn't explain, like in about 2004, somebody got murdered by a young person who's described as homeless, right? And so therefore, every young person who's homeless is now a suspect murderer, right? We have to be afraid of all of them because it happened at one time. Like we generalize about these kind of things with some populations, right? But generally we don't, right? So yes, it's always kind of there, but it does peak up, right? When the press writes about homeless youth in Toronto anyway, it's usually when they are doing, or that person's doing something that's bad or dangerous, right? We focus on their criminality when in fact the research shows really clearly that homeless youth are much more likely to be victims of crime than almost any other segment of the population. But we imagine them to be the criminals. It's they that we're afraid of, they that we have to use the police to protect ourselves from. It should be the other way around. You know, the things we know that happen with homeless youth, you know, research I've done shows, you know, 38% of young women who are homeless were sexually assaulted within the previous 12 months. You know, if that was in my neighborhood, there'd be troops on the streets. But it's homeless youth, so instead let's give them tickets. So we don't pay attention to, you know, when we talk about community safety, we have to think about who is part of the community, because that language gets used all the time to justify law enforcement and criminalization of homelessness. And when we say that community safety, people who are homeless are never considered part of that community. Their safety is not a consideration. So I can't recall if that answers the question. So, yeah.
I have a question for Brian. Hi, Brian. We were in a session yesterday together. So we were in a session yesterday regarding practicing applied and professional anthropology and looking at the creation of standards, methods, and such. And just from your presentation, Brian, which was great, I'm just wondering, are things percolating in your mind, maybe yet or maybe not yet, regarding the lessons learned from this work and how records are used by external agencies, institutions, entities, corporations, whatever, how they're misunderstood, misused. Does this work lead you to maybe include thoughts about that regarding yesterday's session and I guess working that into that kind of criteria?
Well, I'm definitely concerned about the consequences of our cartographic effort, and I think that there out of the 800 sources, we got about 350 maps that anthropologists have made since the 1850s in these territories, and a lot of them kind of just were very unreflexive, reproduced errors or assumptions or all the kind of little silences that slip in, omissions. Certain things are privileged, and all of those end up with kind of a long-term power in our record. And certainly, maps are powerful. And, as we were talking about yesterday, we know that all this kind of anthropological mapping is being, deeply engaged right now by Aboriginal people in the state in the conversation around land and resources and governance. And so I think what it leads me to is, that, really an attention to our abstraction. When we're making these kinds of abstractions around territoriality, for instance, that we do this quite with open eyes, that that in the conversation with the Indigenous communities we work in and often are holding the pen with, as we're describing these, relationships to place, which are so multifaceted, that they just, by simply replicating these old anthropological assumptions over and over again, which are really designed to, essentially find some sort of abstract social unit in which, they could affect more efficient land title extinguishment, and which sounds a lot like the contemporary comprehensive claims policy in Canada. It's the same kind of game that continues on right now. And so I do think, though, I'm encouraged, on the other hand, that we have this, about 50% of our ethnographic record of cartography that we found was more representational in nature, is maybe just more, sort of descriptive of smaller things on the ground, and very, very in place locally. And of course, I'm concerned that, we could only have enough time to talk to so many people, and some of these older ones, there's no women are ever talked to, for instance, and so that, these, all that detail is also, problematic. But I think as we're going forward, and as Indigenous communities are really investing in this, and I think as scholars and collaborators and professional anthropologists who are working hard at this, I think that there are opportunities to build very, complicated, rich ethnographic mapping that it better reflects an Indigenous relationship to place than the simple act of drawing the boundary line. And I was very encouraged by yesterday's kind of technical session at the end, where we were getting into the nuts and bolts of some of the software that you would use to do this. And I know for instance, the folks up at McGill were working in collaboration with the James Bay Cree, doing this kind of thing as well, building very sophisticated systems and through sustained ethnographic engagement, not just a 2-week stint where you're just sort of flying in and out, but that really complicated and interesting cartographies are emerging that are very powerful for the Indigenous communities. And so I'm basically for it, but I think we have to be cautious.
Thanks. I wanted to ask Sara something about the site. In every introduction to anthropology textbook, and every introduction to archaeology, you have a paragraph or more on Cartographic, and those texts are so fixed in nature. When you revise a text, you add a new site, but you don't go back and look at the reinterpretation of the site like that. And your discussion really gets at this, this flexibility and new interpretations of the site. Have any thoughts on how you can sort of translate between the fixity of the text, which is fixed in every student's mind who's ever used one of those books, and this more ongoing interpretive plasticity that you have at this museum?
Yeah, great question. I think that what we're doing at the Visitor Center doesn't even necessarily match what's happening in terms of what the excavation teams themselves, because some of the critiques that are coming out of the excavation work are only just starting to appear. A concern that a lot of the post-processual ideals have never really been realized, and that they're still a long way off But to answer your question in the context of our work, I think that I run a lot of digital heritage stuff, and so most of the efforts are to try to get it online. And the current Chattelhook website is so static and was built at a time that, I don't know, I think keeps it static almost, that even that isn't going to allow any of the flexibility there. So I think it's part of a larger discussion about open access, different types of collaborative web tools, which is something that I use with my students in Britain, but which is slightly more problematic on site because we don't have access to anything but a dial-up internet connection. So that's an ongoing discussion, and I think one that unfortunately I can't answer, although we're trying to open it up and kind of shift away from teaching using textbooks to teaching using open source materials instead.